Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2019. Now that you know how to assign resources to tasks, the next thing we need to move on to is producing a workable schedule given the resources that are available. In order to do that, there are a couple of fundamental things that you need to understand. And perhaps the most important thing to understand with Project 2019 is the different task types that can be evolved in projects. Now, in order to illustrate this, I'm using sort of a dummy project, and this is a very simple project with 3 tasks in it: Task A, Task B, and Task C. And currently their duration is 2 days, and there's 1 resource assigned to each task, and that resource is Jane. And Jane is also working for 8 hours a day. So on Task A, Jane is doing 16 hours work. Task B, 16 hours, and Task C, 16 hours of work. And remember, the reason why Task A is a longer bar, it's spread over a greater number of days, is because we're not counting the weekend as working days. So effectively, she's still working 2 days, the Friday and the Monday. Now let's suppose that I provide Jane with a little bit of help. So I say to Jane, "Hey Jane, John is going to help you with these tasks." Now, if I assign John to Task A, what do you think would happen? Now, what may happen is you may look at it and say, well, obviously Jane is going to be able to get the job done in half the time. So instead of being a 2-day task, it's going to be a 1-day task. And obviously that is one option. But there are a couple of other options as well. One other option is that if John works on that task as well, it will still take 2 days, but they will do 32 hours work during that time. So with twice as much resource, twice as much work gets done, but in the same time. Another possibility is that we still want to get our 16 hours of work done, and we still want to do it in 2 days. But the fact that we've got both Jane and John working on it means they only need to devote half their time to it. So we effectively have 3 different options. And those 3 options correspond to the 3 options you saw in the previous section when Project 2019 said you've changed information about resourcing on a task. So let me just show you that again. I'm going to right-click on Task A, and I'm going to click Assign Resources. I'm going to choose John, and I'm going to click Assign. Now notice the little warning sign on the left there. Project has assumed that in assigning John, I still want to spend 2 days on this task, but having that second person, we're getting twice as much work done. So let's go over to the warning sign and click. The default option there, the middle one, increase the amount of work but keep the same duration. The first one was reduce duration but keep the same amount of work. So in that case, we would have said, well, we're still going to do 16 hours work, but because we've got 2 people on it, we can do it in a day. The third option, reduce the hours resources worked per day, but keep the same duration and work. So we say it's still a 2-day task, it's still only going to be 16 hours work, but Jane and John only need to work half the time each. Now I'm going to stick with the default option here. And what I want to do now is to show you why that was the default option. Let me open up Task A. Now the reason that was the default option was because the task type was declared as a fixed duration. And very importantly, the box to the right of that, effort driven, was not checked. So what this says is that this task is a fixed duration task. It's a 2-day task. And putting more effort in on it will not automatically reduce its duration. So my default is to keep the duration fixed, and therefore if I add a resource to it, I'll just get more work done. Now let me look at Task B. Now the way that Task B is set up is as a fixed work task. So the amount of work is fixed, and all fixed work tasks are effort driven. So note that the effort driven box is checked, but it's grayed out so I can't change it. Now what do you think will happen if I add an additional resource to this task? It's fixed work, it's effort driven. So I'm going to assign John to it. So right click, Assign Resources, John, Assign. And look what happens. I still get 16 hours of work done, but of course now with the additional resource it can be done in 1 day. If I go over to the warning on the left and click on the drop down, the default now, reduce the duration but keep the same amount of work. Well, that's the default for a fixed work task, which is always effort driven. But I could say, increase the amount of work but keep the same duration. So I could say, well, okay, it's declared to be a fixed work task, but on this occasion I want to actually increase the amount of work, having put the additional resource in. And then I have the option of reducing the hours resources work per day. So I could say, okay, I'll put a second person on it. It's fixed work, but because I'm not changing the amount of work, each of the resources only needs to work part-time on it to achieve that amount of work. Now on this occasion, I'm going to stick with the default, and the duration of that task has been reduced by 1 day. Now let's look at task C. Now task C is a fixed unit task, and currently it's not effort driven. Now the significance of the effort driven part is whether in fact what we're trying to do is to do a certain amount of work to put in a certain amount of effort. And in doing that, we're flexing, we're varying the number of people working on it or the duration in order to get that amount done. If a task is not effort driven, then we're not trying to achieve that certain amount of work or put in that certain amount of effort. And if I put more resources onto a task, then all that will happen is that more work gets done. And as a task that's currently not effort driven, if I assign additional resources, and let's really go to town this time. Let's go back into assign resources. So let's go to town this time and add all of them. So I'm going to highlight them all and click assign and close. And now you can see that we're going to get a lot more work done with 4 resources assigned to this task, 64 hours of work. Now, as usual, I've got the yellow warning sign on the left there, and you could choose a different option, but basically we're getting the default, which is increase the amount of work, but keep the same duration. Now let me undo that particular change. And let's go back in now and make it effort driven. Now that means we're trying to achieve a certain amount of work, putting in a certain amount of effort. Now what happens if I assign those 3 extra resources? Given that it's a fixed unit, what do you think is going to happen? Well, let's see. Let's assign our resources. And we're going to assign everybody again. And what's happened is that the duration is reduced. So in half a day, 4 people can do that amount of work. Once again, of course, I get the warning sign and I can change that if I want to. But basically, as it's not fixed duration, putting on that extra number of people means that I can get the work done much more quickly. As I mentioned towards the beginning of this section, we're going to be doing quite a lot of scheduling from now on. And scheduling in Project 2019 can be quite complex at times and requires a bit of understanding of what's going on. There is a very useful help article, How Project Schedules Tasks Behind the Scenes, and it's well worth going through this help article. It's very useful, very well set out, and it gives lots of very helpful information. Of course, I will be covering virtually all of this on the course, and quite often in a little more detail than you've got here. But there is a section in here, and I think it's the 4th one in the list, How do task types affect the schedule? Fixed units, fixed work, and fixed duration. And what will happen if you revise units, if you revise duration, if you revise work, and then gives 1 or 2 really good examples of what happens in different situations. So I do suggest that you take some time to go through this, and it will really help you if you can increase the level of your knowledge on scheduling in Project 2019. And another important point here, and I briefly mentioned this again right near the beginning of the course. In project options on the schedule page, there are a couple of very important settings. One of them is default task type. Mine is set to fixed units. I find that this isn't something that I leave set the same way all the time. I often vary this depending on the type of project that I'm planning. Sometimes setting it to fixed duration or fixed work throughout the time that I'm working on a new project in particular can actually save me time. But I've got it here set to fixed units. And another default here is new tasks are effort driven. In my case, that's not checked. You may find that you prefer your new task to be effort driven, or again, you might vary it from job to job. So that's it. We've covered the basics of task types. In the next section, we're going to start to look at scheduling itself. So please join me for that.